To talk more on the situation in Syria, I'm joined live now by US anti-war activist and journalist Don DeBar. Well, now, the Arab League seems to be seeing eye to eye with Russia on how to deal with the Syrian crisis. Do you see that five-point plan becoming a basis for peace in the country?
Well, it's a reasonable one. The question is basically, will the armed insurgent group agree to lay down their arms, which is a key component. The five-point plan includes, rationally and sanely, a demand that all sides lay down their arms and start talking.
They won't lay down their arms, though, while Assad is in power. We have stalemate here, or do you think Kofi Annan will be able to find a solution?
Well, I mean, the biggest problem is the fact that there's no perception or fact of any prevailing international law. You have sitting in Paris the head of the Syrian National, the SNC, and he's the head of an armed terrorist group opening and operating openly in Paris. Now, if this were the head of al-Qaeda after the attacks in New York, for example, there wouldn't be a place on the planet where the United States wouldn't have the entire United Nations marching in and carting him off the court or killing him and dumping him at sea. So there's no environment for normal legal and political machinery to work anyway. And obviously, this group could not operate in Syria with impunity without the backing of the United States and the Arab League countries.
Well, Qatar and Saudi Arabia, they've sharply criticised Moscow's stance, saying that a ceasefire is not enough and accusing it of giving Assad a free rein to continue to kill civilians in Syria. Is that a fair criticism there?
Well, Qatar and Saudi Arabia both know about killing innocent citizens. They've been doing it for their entire existence, and they're doing it in Bahrain now. I don't think they're in any position to discuss what's been basically a rational, constructive role that Russia has played in this, which is stopping another Libya from coming into existence and leaving the basis for democratic change in Syria.
And what about the role of them saying that it would be a good idea to supply weapons to the Syrian rebels? Some would say, of course, that's covertly happening already, but if they did it officially, that would worsen the situation?
Well, it's happening, in fact, whether it's official or unofficial, but the idea that arming a terrorist group is constructive is a perversion of logic and a perversion of law.
And what if the mission is for regime change and that was to be achieved? What would be the consequences of Assad falling? Many would say far worse than if he should stay in power. And is there a chance, perhaps, that he could stay on in power?
Well, he could stay on in power if the Syrian people want that. He could be removed from power if the Syrian people want that, if it's on their own terms and under their own structures and under their own law. And the possibility of that exists. The referendum allowed for a change, including removing the leading role of the Ba'ath party as the similar situation that was in Iraq and even similar situation that was in the Soviet Union. They have already voted on a constitution that changes that condition, which means that Assad's party is not guaranteed dominance over the government. And people turned out in the midst of a terrorist campaign to vote in numbers that rival the U.S. presidential election in 2008 in terms of the percentage of turnout, and they overwhelmingly adopted the Constitution. So the will of the Syrian people is clear, and there's a way for regime change that's in accord with their wishes.
Don, let's quickly talk about media coverage, finally. Major news channels under fire for their way they're covering the Syrian war, with Al Jazeera seeing some of its employees resigning over its editorial policy. I know that you have actually worked with Al Jazeera. I'd like to know from your experience why you think that is happening.
Well, first of all, that's been ongoing since last April, of 2011. Their senior people, for the head of the bureau in Beirut quit. Many other people quit because of the biased coverage and outright hand of the government in dictating editorial policy over Libya and now Syria. So that's been going on there. I worked with a radio network here in the United States called Pacifica Radio, which was reputedly a progressive radio network. And they had a change in management in 2009. And at the time that this change took place, and there were political changes taking place, I covered it as a journalist for the listeners, as I felt I should. And I was purged. And shortly after that, they replaced most of the locally produced news in the United States with Al Jazeera and held it out to this audience of a progressive radio network as progressive news, which is laughable.
Don, thanks very much indeed for your thoughts. Don DeBar joining me live there in the USA.